Welcome, everybody. This is a webinar, a content webinar of our CAS Certificate in Advanced Studies in International Advocacy and Public Affairs. Today, I will share the floor with my colleague, Christophe Lécureuil, and we're going to split our presentation in two halves, after which we will have time for questions and answers. So I please ask you all to hold your horses so that we can take all the questions once we will finish our presentation. The title of the presentation is the one that you can see on the screen, The Perfect Advocate, Key Attributes and Skills of Today's Influencers. And this is the first slide, which has to do with the contents of the presentation. The first part is going to be my part. I'm Davide Rodogno. I'm the director of the certificate, and I will sketch a very, very open and certainly non-exhaustive taxonomy of the advocates, who are they, and Christophe Lécureuil, who is going to follow my presentation, will definitely answer and engage with the question of who is the perfect advocate. We use something that we permanently use in our classes. And if you wish, these are the three prongs or the fil rouge of our presentation: knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And it's against this backdrop that we're going to talk about the perfect advocate. Before we get there, we would like to share with you a very long definition of advocacy. And as we all know, advocacy means different things to different people. It is the active process of defending or promoting an idea, a person, a cause, a movement, a legislation, a product, or projects. Advocacy aims at influencing, and this is a word that we're going to repeat a number of times, specific audiences. Audiences can be general public, could be peers, could be other influencers, could be decision makers, policy makers, donors, and so on and so forth, for political, institutional, economic, or social reasons. Advocacy can be carried out by individuals, the perfect advocate, groups, they can be the perfect advocate, public institutions, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, companies, trade associations, etc. So, as we do in our classes, we do study the public sector, the international sector, as well as the private sector. Advocacy uses the tools and techniques available to influence perceptions, beliefs, and behaviors, and of course, across times and spaces, they've changed, they've evolved, and some of them have remained the same. Advocacy can be multinational, multidimensional, multi-channel, multi-jurisdiction. It can be local, regional, national, international, or all of these things at the same time. So, who is an advocate and who are the advocates? The advocates engage with particular stakeholders, audiences, the general public, the influencers, with a view to influence their perceptions, beliefs, or behaviors. She, he, they operate at the local, domestic, international, planetary level, or at more level at the same time, as I told you before. And once again, what I'm going to do is to intertwine personality, knowledge, and skills to start my analysis. One of the first things that I would like to say is that advocacy, even if the term is to gain currency in the last 20, 25 years, advocacy existed for at least 200, 250 years. And here you have an example of the mid to late 18th century. You have pressure groups and advocacy, the petitions of the abolitionists, who were a group of people, of white people, that wanted to end slavery and the slave trade, more importantly, already in the late 18th century, and they advocated. Of course, they belonged to elite groups. They already had a logo. We think that the invention of logos is something very, very recently that belongs to the second half of the 20th century, and this is very, very wrong. They had a slogan: "I'm not a man and a brother." And of course, they had heroes and saviors, and very often these were white people very educated, very well connected with political elites. Very often they were members of the parliament, and here you have two very well-known examples, William Blake and William Wilberforce. And now you are going to, say, okay, but this was the 18th century, and we live in 2024. But believe me, there are astonishing continuities between what I'm trying to say and today's world. Another example that is pretty closer to us, the case of Greenpeace. And here again, you have people, you have Bolen, Coate, and Stowe, or the Stowes as a couple, who were activists, pacifists, Quakers. They had skills and knowledge because for a long time they had actively participated to the disarmament movement. So they brought ideas, even including on how to campaign, so the idea of bearing witness. And one of them died very young, and Dorothy passed away in 2010, and she continued to campaign as an advocate for so long. So you have these combination of skills, of knowledge, of competencies that are really important. Something that we tend to forget is that in this story, for instance, against discrimination, very often you have the victims themselves who become the protagonists of advocacy campaigns. And in this particular case, I'm referring to famous Black abolitionists. And here we have Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, who are very well known, and they combine everything that we said so far: personality, even the fact that some of them were victims of discrimination, knowledge, because they knew how to read, how to write, how to communicate, and skills. And this is equally important. So for instance, the organization of rallies, of boycotts, and so on and so forth. So the takeaway point of this part of this presentation is very simple. Bear in mind personality, knowledge, and skills. And in terms of the taxonomy I was referring to in the very first part of my presentation, the person or group who is the victim of a human right violation or an environmental catastrophe very often, not systematically, but very often becomes the champion of the cause she or he advocates. The knowledgeable person advocates to influence. Compassion and empathy move the advocate and her or his or their advocacy. The expert influence and so knowledge and skills are at play, especially when it comes to the private sector, and this is something that we can discuss. And there is something else, especially in the late 20th century and the 21st century, that deserves to be mentioned, which is the case of celebrity advocates. Now, a different non-Western tradition has to do with indigenous movements. I cannot go into the details. Very often, this is not a single individual, but rather a group. We have First Nation in the case of Canada, the United States of America, Aboriginal and Aboriginal movements in Australia, New Zealand, etc. These are rather groups. So I'm trying to draw your attention that the perfect advocate might not be a single individual. When it comes to single individuals, and here we have three very different examples, of course we have, as in the case of Amnesty International, the very well-known role of somebody like Benenson. And of course, this is really more on knowledge and the fact that he was an extremely knowledgeable person, and his skills and his personality and the way he started campaigning. Then you have somebody like Malala, who is herself a victim and starts advocating. And as you can check when you go on the website of the Malala Foundation, you realize that there is an entire ecosystem of people that is absolutely connected and related to the kind of work that she does. And the third example that came to my mind is, of course, Greta Thunberg. And so the question that I leave open for the time being, are they front persons of a more complex ecosystem? When it comes to Greta in particular, we can already detect a number of patterns and paths in her career as an advocate. She starts very young with the school strike for climate. Then she graduates school, she finishes high school. The forms of her activism become very, very different. And in the last year, as you probably know, she has already been arrested and sentenced twice for resisting. So we see also a difference in the way she has been advocating. And of course, as I say, in the right hand side of the slide, although Mrs. Thunberg has not devised any specific environmental strategies, she's credited with raising public awareness of climate change across the world, especially amongst young people. And we can ask ourselves, is this the kind of perfect advocate that we should, try and emulate or take as a reference? And then, of course, the case of celebrities, and I will not have time to elaborate so much. We do that during our certificate. Who are they? What do we do with them? How are they advocating? Do they advocate on their own? Are they part of something bigger? What about their knowledge? What about their skills? And of course, the question of personality is very, very different because everybody knows these people. And here you have a few examples. And I just wanted to quote a very, very interesting article published in 2020, I Take Responsibility and the Limits of Celebrity Activism. Before turning the floor to my colleague, I just wanted to say a few things on faceless advocates. Those that the leaders of movements, we don't know much about. They exist, but they are not the front person. Two examples came to my mind: the Indignados and Extinction Rebellion that you can see with the green logo here, and interesting hybrid groups like Black Lives Matter. We do know perfectly well who are the front persons and those who are at the origin of the movement. Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, Patrice Cullors, of course, everybody knows them. But at the same time, they are not involved in all the multifarious facets of the BLM campaigns. And this is also something that we can discuss. And there is also something else that seems to me quite important: discrete anonymous advocates. Those whose name we will never know, those who advocate under the radars. And in our classes, we insist an awful lot on them because the kind of work that they do is extremely important. And we can draw parallels with negotiators, with diplomats, with policymakers, and so please bear in mind this category as well. So before concluding, just a word on something that must be on your minds: digital advocacy, and of course the post-humanitarian kind of world we live in, where from our sofas or armchairs it's very, very easily to say we support the campaign, or we campaign for this, we do that. And these are just one or two slides to draw attention to this dimension, which we cover way more extensively during our classes, and seems to me to be a very interesting one. I would like to conclude referring to something I came across on LinkedIn on artificial intelligence, and the extent to which, at least this is what is claimed in this article, artificial intelligence is going to become the perfect advocate. I do have very serious doubt this is going to be so essential. But of course, artificial intelligence is going to be a very important tool when it comes to advocating. If, as such, we give artificial intelligence a personality, and we consider artificial intelligence as an autonomous kind of advocate, this is something that is a little bit too early for me to confirm. It might happen in the future, but this remains to be discussed. And without further ado, I turn the floor to my colleague, Christophe Lécureuil. Christophe.
Thank you, Davide. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to take you through a number of thoughts based on some research by recruitment firms and some personal thoughts which I've observed over the years. So who would be the perfect advocate? And Davide mentioned that, personality, knowledge and skills. So we'll go through that for a few minutes before we take your questions. I have to put my glasses on because this is quite far away. So this is a piece of research done by Best in Brussels. And they were asking all the corporates, the trade associations, the NGOs who are doing lobbying in Brussels, what are the most important skills for a public affairs, we call that public affairs in Brussels, leader in any organization. If you look at the top 5, the first one is around integrity and honesty. And that's quite important because that draws trust. And in Brussels, probably unlike Geneva, which is a different beast, people stay. Public affairs practitioners, lobbyists, they stay, and they stay long. So you need to build that trust. So it's particularly important. That would probably be the same in Washington, D.C., where people tend to stay. The second item is around strategy, right? So it's not only about being great at digital, right? It's about being strategic, and that's important to bear in mind. The third aspect is quite interesting. It's around leadership. It's about inspiring and motivating others, probably your team, your colleagues outside the public affairs function, but also all the people you interact with. There's obviously then communication skills, powerful, and it says prolific. I'm not sure what this really means, but powerful is probably most important. And then the last point, which I do care a lot about, is building relationships. As I mentioned, you tend to stay a number of years in this profession. If you want to be a good advocate, you're not just going in and out into a campaign and then nobody sees you anymore. So you need to build relationships. And then you can see a number of things for yourself later on. And I'll refer you to Best in Brussels. Another piece of research done by Spencer Stuart, which is one of the global recruitment firms in corporate affairs, in advocacy, in communications, was called Influence at the Top. And they looked at 10 points. As you can see, they talk about the first one is building relationships, which I thought, okay, it resonates again with me. The second one, which you mentioned at the end of your presentation, Davide, is around being diplomatic. In short, you don't burn bridges. And if you look at the campaigns, they may be very vocal, very successful if they are quite aggressive. But if you're here again for the long term, you have to get some diplomatic skills, right? Resilience, I'll talk about that a bit later. I think it's important. I mean, it's rare that a campaign will be successful in 3 months. If you look at lobbying, it takes years before you get a piece of legislation approved. Even a traditional advocacy campaign will take months, at least, so resilience is important. Perceptive is an interesting part. It fits a bit weirdly into the list of the top 10, but being aware, like Jean-Claude Van Damme would say, being aware of global trend, what's happening, because you don't operate in a vacuum. So understanding what's going on will affect your campaign one way or another. Remaining calm. So we see that with a number of crises that are successfully engaging the different advocates. And you have to take a step back, right? And maybe you'll have to stop your campaign because something is taking on the media agenda. So then you stop, right? Remaining calm. Analytical is probably a mix with what I called a strategy before that. And number 7 was adaptable. And you need to be flexible in this business. Nothing goes as you had planned, nothing, right? So you have to be adaptable, adapt your campaign tactics. Trust goes back probably to the first point of the previous slides. And then the last two are quite interesting as well. Good judgment. You're pretty much an advisor into your CEO, into your boss, and into the wider organization. So you need to have some good judgment. And then, you serve as much coffee as you are putting together a presentation. So we're a bit jacks of all trade. We do a bit of everything. It's important to have some technical skills, and I'll come back to a couple of them in a few minutes. So that's my slide around the perfect advocate. Go back to this personality bucket, knowledge bucket, and skills. The first thing is you can acquire knowledge and you can learn skills. You can teach skills, right? Personality, you don't teach that. So there's something special. It's a personality. There are personality traits which are important. So I'll focus on that first part. I mentioned trust. You have to be trustworthy. If you provide fake information, like it happens a lot at the moment, you're not going to be in that business for a long time. I mentioned resilience. I remember when I was working in the nutrition business for an NGO, it took 10 years probably before your agenda item malnutrition was going to a certain point. You have to be conscientious. It's a lot about details. If there are lawyers in the room, you'll understand what I mean. Sometimes it's a comma, sometimes it's a word that you have to change, and that makes the whole difference. You have to be a good listener. I'll have a slide on that a bit later on, so I'll cover that a bit later. You have to be proactive. So we all tend to sit behind our desk, behind a computer with your job, right? If you don't pick up that phone, call that person that you need to speak to, go and meet, you're going to be less effective. So that's be proactive. I think one of the beauty of this business of being an advocate is around connecting dots. So connecting one policy to another, connecting one organization to another, connecting people. So it's I think what makes it quite interesting. And I think probably a myth is that you have to be extrovert. I don't think so, but you have to be a good networker. So a good networker means you go into a conference, you go and greet people, you want to understand who they are, how can they help you, right? You can put people together in connection as well. So these are some of the personality traits that I've observed over the years, which I think are important. In terms of knowledge and skills, I mean, you can read for yourself and you'll have the slides. I'll cover just a few of the points. Good writer and presenter. It remains an essential skill for a perfect advocate. You'll have to present again and again and again, from small meetings to conferences to media to whoever. And you'll have to write papers, whether they're policy papers, whether they're press releases of one-pager. So you have to be able to write a 20-page report and a one-page press release. And then you have to be a team player, which will bring me to different slides. I mean, we don't do that on our own, being advocates. So you'll have to bring in some teams. It might be legal, it might be politics, might be economics, might be your health specialist, it might be your comms people. It will change a bit according to the campaign you're involved in. But you won't be on your own only with the advocates. Otherwise, you're going to miss a lot of input. The second thing is you will need a number of different skills. Not only these policy skills, but you need people who are connectors, people who are researchers, people who will be the activists going out. You need people who can bring others together. You need a storyteller. So you need a lot of different skills also within that advocacy team on top of their personal knowledge. So in the end, the questions that come back to you as advocates is, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to change behaviors, change policies or legislation, perception, belief that Davide mentioned, practices of an industry? And that will determine the skills that you need in your team. So every advocacy team will be different according to the different campaign that you are engaging. And a few last thoughts. That type of picture. I'm usually a cynic, so usually the first time I see a problem, I see the glass half full. And the next day when I wake up, I see it really full. So I want you to go into, passing that first shock that you see it's going to be a problem, into, okay, how can we, go to the solution? You need to be solution-oriented when you do advocacy. I mentioned, you have to be impermeable to crisis. We're going to live into that perma-crisis situation, whatever it will be. So you need to be able to take that on. You need to be able to explain very complex issues to people who have little time to decide and listen to you. So that's why I like that quote. Everybody has a big issue which is very complex. Decision makers are usually generalists, whether they're politicians or else, and they need some simple messaging. And that's what I mentioned a bit earlier on. You've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. So when you go into meetings, listen to people. You'll get a lot of mileage, a lot of intelligence. We tend to go say, I've got 5-10 minutes, let's download everything. And that's a big mistake. So go into a meeting and say, oh, I understand you're interested into that issue. Can you tell us more about your position at the moment? And then you can adapt your messaging and navigate a bit better. So for me, that summarizes the job of a good advocate. We get lots of data and we're not specialists. So we have to sort it out according to the audience, arrange it properly, present it whether it's visually, whether it's in a written form. And then we tell a story. We are storytellers. That's our job. So before we close, I will ask Davide to come with me so that we can take the Q&A. But Davide, I added also a little LinkedIn poll. So it's not scientific, about 40 people specialized in public affairs answered that. And I was asking them, how do you see artificial intelligence as potential added value for advocacy in public affairs? And I'm not surprised, monitoring and intelligence comes up. I mean, automated monitoring is going to be much easier for us to do. Stakeholder mapping, I thought that was quite interesting as well, to understand who stands where. And then you can see it goes down in terms of the positioning, digital outreach, messaging, where you still need some human brain. And then, of course, the strategy and scenario development was much less interesting for these people who answered. So nothing scientific. You can refer to other pieces of research by the Public Affairs Council. They've done a bit of work on AI. I think that's our last...
Thank you very much, Christophe. I think we can open up the floor for questions and comments. And I turn the floor, maybe, we will take a few seconds before you can formulate your questions or comments on our presentation.
And Bentley, you can use the chat.
Yes. Sorry.
Can you read?
Yes. We can, the questions.
Right. So many thanks for your valuable presentation. My question is the following. Are there any examples of common ethical dilemmas that advocates often face?
Yes, it's an excellent question, and I'm very glad to take it. These ethical dilemmas are a constant feature of most advocacy campaigns. Whether you are interested in the private sector, in the public sector, of course, in international advocacy of sorts. It could be related to human rights, to conflict, to disarmament. It could be related to the environment, and so on and so forth, to discriminations of sorts, etc. The ethical dimension is there systematically. And this is precisely one of the areas where artificial intelligence have an awful lot of miles to run before it can replace the humans. So I think that this is something that we do pay attention an awful lot during the certificate. This is something that we leave to philosophers. We invite systematically a philosopher to address this question. And you refer to ethical dilemmas at the plural, and you're absolutely right, because they are different in nature and in degree, and we would need to go to a specific case to unpack the kind of ethical dilemmas that exist when we operate as advocates in a given context. So they have always been there. I gave the example of the abolitionists and then Greenpeace. They are still with Greenpeace today. They've been with Black Lives Matter from the very inception, and they, of course, shape up the ways in which advocates proceed and the ways in which they advocate. One thing that we didn't do, and just to go further into the details of your question, is the issue, for instance, of violence and the use of violence. In our certificate, we don't deal with advocates that use violence to defend their views or to influence change, whatever is change. But of course, it would be more than legitimate to ask yourself the question and the ethical dilemmas that go with it when we deal with this kind of advocacy that entail some kind of violence. Think about some rallies that can go wrong. I mean, I'm not referring to the use of weapons or anything like that, but even, in protest movements, when things degenerate and get out of control. So this is something that we do pay attention, and it's part of how a campaign should be designed into the smallest details, because of course, if something can go wrong, as Christophe said before, it will certainly go wrong. So you have to anticipate an awful lot. Thank you.
Cécile, Claude, Otello, raise your hand. So if you want to speak, unmute your mic.
Can you name them? We start with?
I'm Cécile. Do you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, hello. Thank you to both of you. That was quite interesting. Just a little question that came to my mind while I was listening to you. Christophe, you mentioned resilience as one of the personal skills to be a perfect advocate. And I was wondering, if you work in-house, how do you, I mean, I'm thinking in-house because this is maybe where you have the most pressing business needs. How do you reconcile resilience and the time, to get to a result with the business needs of the company and, your boss maybe being behind you, pushing to have some results? That was my question.
Thank you, Cécile. I'd suggest when you put your plan together that you identify both what we call the low-hanging fruits that make business sense, even if you don't really think that's super important, but you know that will please your boss and the organization to get a few wins, and then balance that with the medium to longer term issues that need to be addressed that may not be fully understood or are far away in terms of the agenda for your management to understand, but that you want to take into account. So show that you're making progress, getting results on issues that you may feel it's not the priority, it should not be the top priority, but that's the priority of management. I'll take care of it. At the same time, keep track of what you really think is important for the business and take that time to explain that to them. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a written question. Credible information is key for advocacy. With a lot of misinformation and disinformation on critical issues, how can advocates navigate this?
You start? I start. Okay, so we go back to one of the characteristics or main features that Christophe referred a number of times in his presentation, being trustworthy, the issue of trust. The question of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, of course, is very, very important. And I mean, we are not here to take on a moral view on things. And there could be reasons that explain, not to justify, but that explain why in given circumstances, some actors decide to not be entirely clear, not to disclose everything, to give partial information, to misinform, to disinform, etc. What we do in our certificates is precisely to draw the attention of those who might think of doing this kind of things, that it might badly backfire with consequences. So you're taking an awful lot of risks in doing this. And it might be the end of a campaign, might be the end of your advocacy, and you have to be very, very, very careful when you do things like that. So we do not take a moral stance on it, but rather we try to explain, to analyze, and give examples of situations of campaigns that made that fundamental mistake and took some risks, and how, historically speaking, politically speaking, things have gone spectacularly wrong. So it is there, the issue of information, how we inform, the amount of information that we share during a campaign, what are the things that we put forward, and the things that we decide not to put forward, and for what reasons. This is where the quality of the analysis makes a very significant difference.
If I may, Davide, add something on this. And there's a difference between lying, which you should not do as an advocate, and picking arguments that support your position. And I go back to that equivalence with the lawyers. You pick something that will defend the best interest of your clients, or if you're in the company of your organization. So remember that slide around storytelling, right? You are, representing a story, and you are picking the scientific evidence, the backed up arguments that support your position. But don't lie. That's the only thing, because you will get caught. So don't lie, sooner or later.
Sophie Radcliffe raised her hand, so the floor is yours.
Hi, Sophie.
Hi, thank you. I hope you hear me well. I've had some problem with my mics recently. Okay, good. So I work now in Brussels as an advocate, and I work for the sector of research. And something that I noticed in Brussels is the difference of resources from one sector to another. And I know many people who work in public affairs in many of the companies quoted in Best in Brussels. And the amount of resource, especially financial resource, that some industry can put into public affairs specialists on one specific legislative file is maybe 100 times what my sector has to cover sort of the whole higher education research and innovation policies. So I wanted to know if you have any research on that, or maybe any advice on how can we find this difference, because at some point we end up on the same files. And it's very hard for us to compete with some industrial representatives on that.
I'll take that one. I don't have precise research that would demonstrate that industry in general has much more financial means to support pieces of research. So that probably can be found. I mean, you can also get a lot of information on the Transparency Register, where if you want to be an effective lobbyist in Brussels, you need to be on that register. And there's a lot of information. What I would say is that if we assume that there's lots more money available for the private sector in general, for industry, versus the NGO, the educational community, the result is not that straightforward in terms of legislation, because if you look at the way the Parliament and the Council votes when they vote together, it often goes into in the favor of the NGOs. So it's not that clear-cut, if you will, the amount of money that you may have at your disposal for lobbying versus the impact that you will have with sound argumentation that you may have yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, it's just the following up of what the woman said, because in fact, I'm very happy about her question. And the following up is that what is the most effective? You say that what is important is to change something in the mindset or the behavior of somebody else. Then what is the most important? The mindset, the belief, the actions? What at which level is more effective, and how to do it then?
I guess it depends what your objective is. So let me take an example. If you're an NGO or a government that wants to reduce the amount of consumption of a certain product, which is high in salt, fat, or sugar, your objective might be different. You may have one line of strategy that says, I want to change behavior, right? So in that sense, then you need probably an advertising campaign, etc. But you may want, to make the product less available, which means you need to change the legislation so that that product is not being sold to kids when they go out of school, for example. So I think it depends on the overall goal that you have, and then how you cut it.
Yeah, if I may add on this particular one, it's this is typically one of those circumstances when listing or coming up with a kind of ranking might be useful, but since we are very complementary and I really am more on the academic side, I can give you, and probably already, how scholars are divided when it comes to evaluating the effectiveness of the work of the advocacy of Greta Thunberg, which I mentioned very rapidly. And basically, the scholarly world is divided in two halves. I generalize here, of course, things are more nuanced than that. There are those that say, well, yeah, she did a good job in terms of raising awareness, but when it comes to be effective, she's not. And there are those that say, well, but we had to start from raising awareness, so she was very impactful. And I do not have an answer on that. But in terms of, changing, if the purpose is changing belief or drawing attention, raising awareness, there are things that we can do as advocates, and in a certain way, when it comes to changing legislation, for instance, you might be effective, and we go back to the question of resilience that was mentioned before, but it might take 10 years, 15 years before that piece of legislation is going to be changed at the national level, not to mention at the international level. And very often, the audiences are impatient. They don't stick with an issue for 10 years, 15 years. So keeping that level of awareness up for so long is in itself a challenge. So, the issue of how we measure all that is an extremely complex one. And this is why we go very, very easy when it comes to that.
And in the course, by the way, there's a big session on measurements, because that's one of the critical gaps into advocacy.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. If there are no further questions, we would like to remind all of you that those of you that participated, all of you online, that the Executive Education is going to send our presentation later on with all the administrative details about the certificates in international advocacy and public affairs, the dates, and of course, contacts so that you can call them, you can write them, and if you are interested, of course, Christophe and I will be with you to, ready to answer whatever questions or comments you might have. And if there are no further questions, let us thank you all for participating, for the fantastic questions that we had. We really hope you enjoyed. I would like to thank Christophe and Stephen, who is behind the scenes coordinating questions. And so thank you all, and thank you to my colleagues. See you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.